Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we are not tiptoeing around history, we are wading directly into its darkest, coldest current. You are standing now, in your mind's eye on the muddy banks of the River Thames, the chill air biting at your face, the ancient stones of the Tower of London looming against a charcoal sky. You can smell the stale river water, and something else, a faint metallic tang that has seeped into the very bedrock of this fortress, a scent that whispers of iron and blood. This isn't just a historical site, it's a silent, sprawling graveyard where the powerful met their end in the most humiliating public or, worse, tragically private ways. Feel the cobbles under your feet. They are worn smooth not just by centuries of rain, but by the nervous steps of countless doomed souls. You might think of the tower as a museum, but tonight you are its unwilling guest. And trust me, you probably won't survive this journey into the brutal reality of royal power games. You're about to trace the steps of queens and noble women whose only crime was to be inconvenient, too ambitious, or related to the wrong person. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is for you in the comments. Sometimes it helps to know we're all traversing this dark history together, even if you're listening at 3 a.m. while staring at the ceiling. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You turn your attention toward the infamous Traitor's Gate, the only way in for prisoners of state arriving by water. You see the heavy, iron-bound doors, perpetually damp, reflecting the flickering torchlight. This isn't the main tourist entrance. This is the ceremonial exit from polite society, a one-way portal from the freedom of the river to the crushing confinement of the inner fortress. Imagine being rowed under that chilling archway, the low roof pressing down, the murmuring crowd already lining the banks, their faces indistinct in the gloom, their silence more deafening than any jeer. The tide is high now, swirling murky and fast, just as it was for many of the women whose stories we will unfold. The true terror of the tower wasn't necessarily the executioner's axe, but the slow, psychological grind of knowing you would cross this threshold, and that your fate was sealed by a stroke of a pen from someone you once called a friend or a husband. The very first women executed in or near the tower were, predictably, not queens, but players in the earlier, messier dramas of medieval English succession. You have to rewind the tape to the Wars of the Roses, a chaotic, bloody family feud that makes your most dysfunctional holiday gathering look like a Quaker meeting. One of the first high-profile female executions that set a terrifying precedent occurred in the 1570s, during the tumultuous reign of Edward IV. While not executed inside the tower walls, her death was intrinsically linked to its function as a political prison. This was a time when nobility was both your greatest asset and your biggest liability, the ultimate high-risk, high-reward investment. The mainstream historical fact here is that the execution of these early noblewomen, often for acts of treason or supporting a rival faction, confirmed the tower's role as the final destination for political enemies, regardless of gender. It stripped away the last vestiges of special protection that high birth might have offered, signalling a new, harsher political reality. One of the quirky tidbits from this era is the fact that many of the early women imprisoned here, before the official royal executions, were held under relatively comfortable conditions, often bringing their own servants and furniture, an arrangement that would seem bafflingly polite to later Tudor prisoners. They were confined, yes, but they were still ladies of rank, and the tower struggled initially with the decorum of incarcerating them. They essentially brought their tiny doomed court with them. This was less a prison and more exceedingly inconvenient, heavily guarded house arrest, a stark contrast to the small cold rooms that would host the future queens. Now, historians still argue whether the perceived clemency shown to early female prisoners, often being granted more comfortable lodgings than their male counterparts, was a genuine act of medieval chivalry, or simply a logistical issue of not having suitable female-specific cells. It's an interesting semantic debate, but it doesn't change the fact that the block eventually waited for them all. The distinction between a plush velvet curtain and a cold stone wall disappears when the outcome is the same. As you move beyond the medieval period and into the age of the Tudors, the tower's function as a stage for tragedy intensified dramatically. Henry VIII didn't invent the concept of executing his political opponents, but he certainly scaled it up and perfected the art of making it personal. He turned the institution of monarchy into a revolving door of wives, and the tower became the inevitable exit for the ones who failed the audition. His need for a male heir, his volatile temper, and the absolute power he accumulated meant that disagreement, infidelity real or imagined, or even a political mistake by a relative, was grounds for a charge of treason. Treason was the elastic, catch-all charge of the era, the legal equivalent of, we just don't like you anymore. It bypassed the need for fiddly things like evidence or justice. It's easy to forget that before Henry VIII became the corpulent, paranoid tyrant we picture, he was a dashing, highly educated Renaissance prince. It makes the coldness with which he dispatched two of his queens, and several other female relatives, even more chilling. He wasn't acting from a position of simple barbarity, but from a calculated political necessity masked by legal procedure. When you look at the tower today, you're seeing the end point of that calculation. It is the architectural manifestation of absolute power. You are now walking through the outer ward, the footsteps of the yeoman warders, the famous beefeaters echoing around you. They are the constant and unbroken thread of history. They escorted the condemned, watched the executions, and now they lead the tourists. They have seen it all, and if those scarlet and black uniforms could talk, they would speak of the screams in the night, the whispered confessions, and the sheer, overwhelming loneliness of incarceration here. They didn't see you, but you definitely see them. You can't help but notice the way one of them adjusts his hat. He seems to have a slightly exaggerated, world-weary sigh, like he's thinking, oh, another doomed ghost following the tour group. The women who followed the early medieval victims were different. They were higher stakes, their blood thicker with royal significance. These were women whose demise changed the direction of a nation, shaped the religious landscape, and set the stage for one of the most famous female monarchs in history, Elizabeth I. It's important to understand the geography of the executions. Most people were executed on nearby Tower Hill, a public spectacle intended to terrify the populace into submission. However, a select few, those deemed too significant, whose public humiliation might accidentally incite sympathy or riot, were afforded the privilege of a private execution on Tower Green, within the walls. This was less of a kindness and more of a damage limitation exercise by the Crown. It's on that green, a deceptively peaceful patch of grass near the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, that our story's most shocking chapters unfold. You can almost hear the soft thud of the axe on the sand, muffled by the stone walls of guards and officials. As we transition into the first queen to die here, you must hold this image. The Tower of London is not just a building. It is a meticulously designed machine for breaking the human spirit before ending the human life. Every stone, every narrow passage, every spiked gate contributes to the crushing finality. The stage is set, the executioner is ready, and the first Tudor queen is about to enter the gates. You feel a sudden draft. Is it just the wind, or the passage of a restless soul? The sheer scale of the building is overwhelming. It swallows your presence whole. You are insignificant here, a mere shadow in a place built for kings, and designed to end the lives of those who dared to defy them. This fortress is history's most unforgiving editing bay, where Henry VIII simply cut out the parts of his life he no longer desired. You begin to walk the inner perimeter, following the ghost of a young woman with dark, intelligent eyes, and a smile that had promised a king the world, before it promised her the block. You are leaving the chill of the Traitor's Gate now and moving inward, but the cold sensation remains, clinging to you like river mist. Our attention must now sharpen, focusing on the woman who arguably remains the tower's most famous and most tragic resident, Anne Boleyn. You probably know the broad strokes: second wife of Henry VIII, mother of Elizabeth I, executed for treason and adultery. But to understand the shock of her execution, you have to appreciate the audacity of her rise, the sheer scale of the political earthquake she caused. Imagine yourself back in the court of Henry VIII around 1527. The atmosphere is less Downton Abbey, and more a high-stakes, glittering reality show where the prize is the king's attention, and the penalty for failure is often death. Henry is desperate for a male heir. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a woman of deep piety and strong Spanish lineage, has produced only one surviving child, the Princess Mary. In an era where a stable succession was the only thing preventing a civil war, this was a crisis. Then Anne arrives. She's not a conventionally beautiful queen in the mould of the time, not tall, fair, or stately. Instead, she is described as having dark, captivating eyes, a sharp wit and an effortless style that had been honed during her years in the sophisticated courts of France. She had that indefinable it factor that simply made every other woman in the room look a little less interesting. She was, essentially, the most compelling new upload in a court obsessed with trending topics. The mainstream historical fact is that Anne Boleyn's refusal to become Henry's mistress, insisting, instead, on being his wife, was the catalyst for the English Reformation, directly leading to the separation of the Church of England from papal authority. This wasn't just a royal divorce, it was a revolution fueled by a king's desire and a woman's ambition. You watch as Henry becomes utterly obsessed. He pours forth love letters, now famous, letters you can almost feel the parchment of in your hand. They are passionate, desperate, and increasingly impatient. You see Anne playing the long game, a masterpiece of strategic coyness and intellectual engagement. She didn't just bat her eyelashes, she debated theology and politics with the king, making herself indispensable not just as a Roman, but the king's wife keeps hope in parts. This is a life of purity and pride. This refusal to simply submit is demanding of the ultimate prize, is what made her so dangerous and so revolutionary. She wasn't just seeking a crown, she was having to engineer a seismic political shift to get it. The quirky tidbit here relates to her famous symbol. Anne Boleyn's personal device was a crowned falcon, symbolising her soaring ambition and royal status. However, some contemporary accounts suggest that her original choice was, rather audaciously, a crowned white hind pursued by a lion, an overt symbol of her as the coveted prey and Henry as the predator. She was forced to change it, as it was considered far too suggestive and provocative for a queen to be. But it hints at her bold, almost theatrical approach to courtly life. She knew how to work the angles, how to create a buzz, and how to stay relevant in the time when courtly attention spans were notoriously short. It's like she invented the concept of going viral, but with much higher stakes. You're now in 1533. The divorce from Catherine of Aragon is finally granted, and Henry marries Anne in a secret ceremony. Her coronation, an elaborate and hugely expensive spectacle, is staged to solidify her new status in the eyes of the realm. You can hear the sounds of the celebration now, the trumpets blaring, the shouts of the crowd, the rich rustle of silk and velvet as she is borne through the streets of London. She has achieved the impossible. She is queen, and she is pregnant. The expectation is immense. She must deliver a male heir to validate the king's monumental gamble. When she gives birth, however, it is to a girl, the future Elizabeth I. Henry is predictably disappointed, but the initial warmth remains. The marriage is still fresh, the political alliance still necessary. But the clock is ticking, and the atmosphere at court begins to subtly shift. Anne suffers a miscarriage, and then, crucially, another, which Henry morbidly blamed on supernatural forces or, more likely, perceived moral failing. The lack of a son, the entire reason the English church was torn from Rome, became the unforgivable failure. The love that had moved mountains was quickly turning into resentment, then political liability. Historians still argue whether Anne Boleyn's increasingly isolated political position was due to her own abrasive personality and lack of political allies. She was famously sharp-tongued and made enemies easily, or simply the inevitable result of Henry's growing paranoia and the schemes of her rivals. It's the ultimate nature versus nurture debate in royal history. Was she doomed by her character, or by the system? It's a crucial distinction, because if it was the system, then any woman in her position was just one failed pregnancy away from the block. And that is the truly chilling thought. You are watching her, in the final months of her power, trying desperately to regain control. She promotes her own men, uses her influence to advance the Reformation cause, and attempts to steer the king's policy. But Henry's eye, already wandering to the quiet, politically safe Jane Seymour, is no longer focused on her. Her wit, which had charmed him, now irritates him. Her strong will, which had attracted him, now seems like a dangerous defiance. The pendulum of Henry's affection had swung from adoration to outright hostility, a movement as predictable as the tides of the Thames, and just as deadly. The king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, a man Anne had initially supported, suddenly saw an opportunity. He was under political pressure himself, and realised that by removing the increasingly unpopular queen, he could eliminate a powerful faction and consolidate his own authority. The story of Anne's fall is not just a tale of a jilted husband, but of a calculated political assassination engineered by the very men who owed her their position. It's a classic case of the apprentice finally surpassing and then eliminating the master. The stage for her downfall had to be spectacular and legally sound, however flimsy the soundness was. The charges needed to be shocking, something that would turn the tide of public opinion instantly against the Queen, who had divided the nation. Adultery was not enough for a queen. It had to be high treason, and to be treason of the highest order. The charges were monstrous: adultery with multiple men, incest with one brother, and plotting to murder the king. These charges weren't meant to be believed in a court of law. They were meant to be believed in a court of public opinion. And they worked. The sheer repulsive nature of the accusations made her political survival impossible. You feel a knot in your stomach as you realise the full horror of her predicament. The woman who had changed the course of English history for love was now trapped by a web of fabricated filth, with her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, implicated alongside her. The charges were a deliberate, brutal tool designed to destroy her reputation so completely that her execution would seem like an act of divine necessity, rather than political convenience. The powerful force she unleashed with her ambition, the king's will, was now rushing back to consume her. As we prepare for the next section, you see the court of 1536 descending into a frenzy of whispers, arrests, and fear. The king is suddenly absent, isolating himself as the drama unfolds, a tactical move to suggest his deep emotional pain rather than his cold political calculus. Anne's friends are rounded up, interrogated, and pressured into giving false confessions. The machinery of the state, which she had helped to create, was now relentlessly focused on her destruction. Her moment of glory, her coronation, was just 3 short years past. Now, she is about to make her final journey down the Thames, a journey she had taken in triumph, but would now take in chains. You can almost hear the lapping water against the hull of the barge, carrying the Queen of England to her doom. The ride to the Traitor's Gate begins now. You are standing at Greenwich Palace, not far from the royal apartments, and the atmosphere is thick with a terrified silence that follows a sudden, violent upheaval. It is May 2nd, 1536. Just days before, Henry VIII had been enjoying a May Day jousting tournament. Anne Boleyn was present, seemingly oblivious to the abyss opening beneath her feet, though historians note she was reportedly withdrawn and melancholic. Suddenly, abruptly, Henry left the tournament, not even bothering to say goodbye to his queen. That abandonment, that calculated public snub, was the first tremor. The next morning, the earthquake hit. You watch as Anne is summoned from her private chambers, not to the king, but to a panel of cold, stern-faced men. Henry's brother-in-law, the Duke of Norfolk, ironically, her own uncle, who would play a central role in her demise, and several of the king's counsellors. The accusations are delivered with the brutal detachment of an official legal proceeding. They inform her that she is accused of high treason, adultery, incest, and plotting the king's death. Imagine the whiplash, the sheer psychological terror of that moment. 1 minute, you're Queen of England, surrounded by silk and deference. The next, you're a criminal, facing the most hideous possible death. She protests, of course, her voice likely rising with a mix of genuine indignation and mounting panic. She demands to see the king, convinced that her husband, the man who had overturned the world for her, would never believe such monstrous lies. But Henry is gone, replaced by a rule of cold official protocol. This is the moment you realise that the man who loved you is more dangerous than any political enemy. The mainstream historical fact that underscores this moment is that Anne Boleyn's arrest was managed with such swiftness and secrecy by Thomas Cromwell that it precluded any possibility of a popular uprising or a coordinated defence by her remaining allies, showcasing a masterpiece of state-sponsored political elimination. The scene shifts now rapidly. She is divested of her queenly regalia, the elaborate jewellery, the rich gowns. The barge that is to carry her to the Tower is waiting. This is not the royal barge of her glorious coronation, with its silken canopy and heraldic banners. This is a simple dark vessel, a floating cage. You are now standing with her on the banks of the Thames, ready for the journey. The river, which had brought her to power, now carries her to her doom. It's almost a Greek tragedy played out on London's waterways. As the barge pushes off, you feel a slow, steady pull of the current. You're travelling the exact route of her triumphal entry into London years earlier, but the crowds are gone, replaced by a scattering of shocked onlookers and the king's heavily armed guard. The air is heavy, the only sound the rhythmic splash of the oars and the creak of the wooden hull. Anne is weeping, sometimes hysterically, sometimes collapsing into bouts of despair, convinced that God must be punishing her, but she insists on her innocence regarding the specific charges. She has for the first time seen the full, terrifying extent of Henry's cold cruelty. As the boat approaches the tower, the ultimate horror unfolds, the traitor's gate. You feel the hull scrape against the stone. The great arch looms over you, dark and final. She steps out onto the wet, slick stone steps, the damp chill permeating her thin clothing. The constable of the tower, Sir William Kingston, is waiting. He is, by all accounts, a decent man caught in an atrocious duty, but his presence only confirms the finality of her situation. She knows this man is the last person she will see before her God. The quirky tidbit from this harrowing arrival is that Anne Boleyn, upon entering the gate and seeing Sir William, reportedly fell to her knees in a fit of trembling, crying and laughter. She famously said to Kingston, "Mr. Kingston, shall I go into a dungeon?" Kingston politely but devastatingly replied, "No, madam, you shall go into the lodging prepared for you." Her breakdown, this unsettling mix of tears and inappropriate laughter, is a historically noted psychological reaction to profound sudden trauma, a complete shattering of the raw composure she had so carefully cultivated. She is then led through the inner ward. You trace her steps, past the startled yeoman warders, past the lantern tower, until she reaches the Queen's lodgings in the royal palace section, the very chambers she had recently occupied as Queen. This is not a dark, rat-infested cell. It is a suite of rooms fit for a queen, which makes the imprisonment infinitely more cruel. To be confined in the familiar space where you once held court, slept with your husband, and planned the future of the kingdom, it's psychological torture of the highest order. Every piece of furniture, every window view, every shadow on the wall would be a screaming reminder of what she had lost. Inside the chambers, Sir William Kingston is instructed to place 3 trustworthy female servants, chosen by the Crown, not by Anne, to wait upon her and, more importantly, to report every single word she uttered. You realise this is a prison designed to eavesdrop on the soul. Anne's every cry, every muttered prayer, every unguarded remark would be recorded, twisted, and used as evidence against her and the men accused alongside her. She is not just a prisoner, she is the unwilling source of her own evidence. You watch her pacing, frantic, moving from the window to the fireplace. She asks Kingston repeatedly about the charges, demanding to know the specifics, the names of her accusers. Kingston is evasive, following his orders perfectly. He is both her warden and her psychological torturer, simply by his presence and his refusal to give any comfort or information. She begins to ask about the men arrested on her behalf, especially her brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. Her concern for her brother is genuine and heartbreaking, a rare moment of sibling affection shining through the terrifying political game. She knows deep down that her fate is sealed, but the instinct for survival, the ingrained defiance that had made her queen, compels her to fight on. She oscillates between periods of intense tearful prayer and moments of fierce, almost regal composure. She asks for the sacrament, but Kingston, ever the careful administrator, replies that he must check with the king's council first, a cruel denial of spiritual comfort that suggests she is already considered condemned. Historians still argue whether Anne Boleyn, during her imprisonment, ever truly understood the political necessity driving her execution. Was she hopelessly naive, believing that Henry's love might still save her? Or did she fully grasp that she was a political casualty, the unfortunate side effect of a king who needed a divorce more than a queen? Her reported statements, alternating between despair, rage, and almost childlike hope, suggest she was caught between the two, unable to fully reconcile the terrifying reality with the memory of the love that had been. It's a debate that touches on the ultimate question of whether Tudor queens were women who held power, or simply temporary vessels for male ambition. As the days crawl by within those royal apartments, the walls that once protected her now enclose her. The Queen's lodgings become a stage for the final act of a devastating play. Her servants dutifully report her every word. She speaks of Jane Seymour, the woman who will replace her, hoping Henry will treat Jane better than he treated her. It is a moment of profound, quiet resignation. She is not fighting a legal battle anymore, she is preparing her soul. The sheer loneliness is palpable. You see her trying to maintain some semblance of dignity, asking for a priest, asking about her daughter Elizabeth. But even these requests are filtered through the cruel machinery of state control. The only person allowed to visit her is her jailer, and his job is not to comfort her, but to ensure she is ready for the ultimate betrayal. The stage is set for the trial, but you realise the verdict was rendered the moment she passed under the traitor's gate. You remain in the Queen's lodgings within the tower, standing witness to the psychological destruction of a monarch. Anne Boleyn has been here for several days now, and the initial shock of her arrest has given way to a terrifying, grinding reality. You note the incongruity. This suite of rooms, usually reserved for the reigning monarch or their most honoured guests, is now her exquisite, cold cage. So free to see. The tapestry on the wall, the fine linen on the bed, the sight of the Thames flowing past the window, all serve as agonising reminders of the life and power that have been snatched away. The cruel genius of this confinement is its familiarity. Every detail of the room would have been an echo of her former glory. When she moves, the rustle of her gown is amplified in the tense quiet, and you notice the 3 hand-picked attendants, Lady Wingfield, cousins, and Lady Boleyn, her estranged sister-in-law, a spy against her, are constantly present. Their presence is a suffocating blanket. They are not there to comfort. They are human microphones for Thomas Cromwell, tasked with logging every word, every sigh, every moment of weakness. You can practically see the quill scratching on the parchment as they later transcribe their reports. This is a very early, very high-stakes version of closed-circuit surveillance. Anne's state of mind is a turbulent sea. She swims violently between a desperate, almost manic cheerfulness and complete weeping despair. She insists over and over that she has been a good queen to Henry, but her mind is clearly struggling to process the treason charges, particularly the grotesque accusation of incest with her own brother George. She asks her attendants, sometimes in a quiet whisper, sometimes in a shout, "Wherefore should I be here?" It is the simple, heartbreaking question of someone who knows she is trapped, but cannot fathom the true depth of the betrayal. One quirky tidbit about this stage of her imprisonment is the particular focus of her paranoia. Anne became obsessed with a single event that she believed was being twisted against her, a conversation she had with Sir Francis Weston, one of the men later executed for adultery with her. She recalled telling him he looked ill, and that he replied he was pining for her. She had lightly chastised him, saying she could not mend him. In her highly agitated state, she kept revisiting this trivial exchange, terrified it was being used as a sign of undue familiarity. To us, it sounds like an everyday courtly flirtation. To her, trapped and facing death, it was a damning piece of evidence, and she repeated the story endlessly to her attendants, inadvertently giving them more material for their reports. You hear her in the quiet hours of the night, praying aloud for deliverance, or simply calling out for her daughter Elizabeth. The mainstream historical fact is that during her confinement, Anne Boleyn repeatedly and emphatically proclaimed her innocence of the crimes of adultery and incest, though she admitted to some youthful frivolity in her behaviour at court. Her consistency on this point, even when facing death, has led many subsequent historians to believe she was entirely innocent of the specific charges that sealed her doom. The charges were purely political, necessary to dissolve the marriage ab initio from the beginning, and ensure that her daughter, Elizabeth, could also be declared illegitimate, thereby simplifying Henry's succession problem. She also attempts to cling to her religious faith, the very faith she championed by promoting the Protestant cause. She requests the sacrament, the physical comfort of communion, but Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower, must continually deny her this comfort until the King's Council deems her worthy, a bureaucratic denial of grace that twists the knife of her spiritual suffering. Kingston is recorded as being remarkably patient, a man trying to be humane while executing inhuman orders. He provides reports that are factual but tinged with a slight melancholy regarding the Queen's mental state, noting her extreme distress and the frequent great fits of crying she suffered. He is merely an administrator of tragedy. You observe the stark isolation. All her former friends are either arrested, like her brother and the 4 courtiers, or they have simply melted away, terrified of being implicated by association. The political climate is one of sheer terror. No one dares to speak up for the condemned Queen. The atmosphere in London is a mixture of shock and quiet satisfaction from the Catholic faction, who hated her for driving the Reformation. Anne had always been a divisive figure, and her fall was a moment of vindication for her many enemies. Historians still argue whether Anne Boleyn's final days revealed genuine piety or a calculated performance for posterity. Some scholars view her dramatic pronouncements of innocence and her intense praying as a carefully staged effort to ensure the chroniclers recorded her as a martyr, safeguarding her reputation and the future of her daughter Elizabeth. Others believe the stress broke her entirely, leaving only a woman in genuine fear of God and man, desperately seeking forgiveness for any lesser sins she may have committed. The truth probably lies in the terrifying intersection of the two, a queen using her final moments to control the narrative, while genuinely grappling with a shattered faith and imminent death. The physical enclosure is mirrored by a psychological one. She can walk the perimeter of the royal apartments, perhaps look out onto the courtyard, but the walls of the fortress are an unbreakable boundary. Every minute is spent waiting for the inevitable. The reports are filed, the men are interrogated, and the trial is being prepared. A performance of justice that is about to take place just yards away from where you stand. The true horror isn't the axe, which will be quick, but the weeks leading up to it, spent in the rooms that were once her sanctuary and are now her mausoleum. You watch as the psychological pressure mounts, turning her moments of lucidity into rare islands in a sea of despair. She begins to ask about the specific means of her death. She had heard rumours, perhaps, of a special executioner. She tries to joke, a nervous, high-pitched laugh that chills you to the bone. She asks Kingston if the king has sent for the executioner, and when Kingston says he has not, she immediately says, "I hear say that the executioner is very expert, and I have a very little neck," putting her hands around it and laughing again. This gallows humour, this macabre tempted levity, is the final flicker of her once famous wit, twisted into something horrifying by the pressure of her impending death. This dark, suffocating confinement is designed to ensure that when she finally steps out to face the court, she will be broken, incapable of mounting a strong defence. The Tower, in this instance, is not just a jail, it is a psychological weapon, a dark medieval tool for preemptively destroying the will of the accused. You feel the heavy, oppressive silence of the stones, the kind of silence that doesn't absorb sound, but seems to crush it. The trial, the ultimate theatrical sham, is about to begin. You can already hear the faint murmur of voices from the great hall, preparing for the scene of her final public humiliation. You move from the suffocating intimacy of the Queen's lodgings and into the grim spectacle of the great hall within the Tower, where Anne Boleyn's trial is now underway. The setting is formal, terrifying, and completely predetermined. You feel the temperature drop, not from the physical cold, but from the frigid atmosphere of manipulated justice. The room is packed with spectators, members of the nobility, legal officials, and spies, all eager to witness the fall of the woman who dared to challenge the established order and then failed to deliver a son. The trial is not being held in Westminster Hall, the usual venue for trials of state, but here, inside the Tower, a logistical detail that screams of urgency and a desire for control. This allows the king and his agent Thomas Cromwell to manage the proceedings away from the potentially volatile public gaze of London, ensuring the outcome is swift and non-negotiable. The proceedings are headed by her own uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, acting as Lord High Steward. This detail alone tells you everything you need to know. The presiding judge is not only a family member, but a political rival who saw the removal of Anne as beneficial to his own faction. The jury consists of 26 peers, all of whom have been carefully selected by Cromwell. They are men who either owe their power to Henry VIII or fear his displeasure far more than they value truth or justice. The mainstream historical fact about this trial is that its legality was deeply questionable, as the charges relied solely on vague accusations, forced confessions from the accused men which were often immediately retracted, and a complete lack of any material evidence, making it a stark example of a political show trial disguised as due process. Anne Boleyn stands before them, not in the rich robes of a queen, but in a simple dark gown, stripped of all her former glory. Despite the psychological torment of her imprisonment, she attempts to regain her composure, demonstrating the defiance that had once captivated Henry. She is said to have possessed an exceptional legal mind, having been steeped in court politics for years, and she mounts a spirited defence, questioning the lack of specific dates and locations for the alleged adulterous encounters. You watch as she speaks, her voice perhaps trembling but resolute, pointing out the absurdity of the charges. How could she have committed adultery with 4 different courtiers and her own brother, often in places and times that were demonstrably impossible? The charges themselves are read out, a litany of the sensational and the obscene. Adultery with Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton, and incest with her brother George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. The charge of plotting the king's death, the necessary element for high treason, is the chilling legal capstone. It was argued that her adulterous acts and desires to run away would somehow lead to the king's demise. An utterly preposterous link that no court would tolerate today, but which served the political purpose perfectly then. The quirky tidbit surrounding the trial centres on the testimony of Mark Smeaton, a young court musician and one of the accused lovers. Smeaton, a man of lower birth, was held in the Tower and reportedly tortured or certainly threatened with it until he confessed to the affair. His confession was the linchpin of the prosecution's case. However, at the trial, he was the only one of the accused men not allowed to speak, and his confession was read out. When asked if he persisted in his statement, he merely bowed his head in miserable silence. His confession, likely forced, made him the prosecution's most crucial and most tragic witness, simultaneously condemning the Queen and sealing his own fate. By contrast, the other accused men, all gentlemen, fiercely denied the charges until their deaths. The legal framework of the trial, known as a Bill of Attainder, meant the evidence did not have to meet the rigorous standard of common law. The will of the king, manifested through Cromwell and Norfolk, was the only required evidence. Historians still argue whether George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, who was tried separately in the same hall, hurt Anne's defence more by his own, albeit unsuccessful, attempt to defend himself using legal arguments, or whether his conviction was simply inevitable due to his familial relationship with the Queen. His spirited, inarticulate defence was said to have greatly impressed the audience, but it infuriated the king's men, and ultimately did him no good, confirming that intellectual prowess was useless against the immovable object of royal necessity. You notice the mood of the jury. They are uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, but their faces are set in stone. They know their duty, to convict. To acquit the Queen would be to risk their own lands, their families, and their lives by directly contradicting the king's expressed will. In the Tudor court, the king's wish was law, and the pretense of a fair trial was merely a performance for the historical record, ensuring that future generations could say the process was followed. When the verdict of guilty is finally announced, a silence falls over the great hall, a heavy dead thing that seems to suck the air out of the room. Anne's composure finally breaks, but only for a moment. She rises and delivers a powerful final address. She does not beg for mercy. She knows that is useless. Instead, she appeals to the king for spiritual grace and the good of her soul. She states her belief that she was convicted by malice and the envy of my adversaries, not by any factual crime. Her speech is a calculated act of defiance, not against the law, but against the historical narrative. She is fighting for her reputation, the only thing they cannot take from her. The sentence is read, to be burned at the stake or beheaded, at the king's pleasure. Henry, in a final gesture of what he deemed mercy, chooses beheading. This slight preference for a less painful death is cold comfort, but it serves as a crucial distinction. Only common criminals were typically burned. By choosing beheading, Henry acknowledged a shred of her royal status, a minor concession that was entirely overshadowed by the monstrous injustice of her conviction. As she is led away, back to the Queen's, as you realise the entire ordeal, from arrest to condemnation, has taken less than 2 weeks. It was a terrifyingly efficient destruction. You feel the weariness in her steps as she returns to her cage, where she must now prepare for the final chapter. The trial did not unravel justice. It was deliberately manipulated, a grim puppet show where the strings were pulled by the ever-calculating hands of Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII. The machinery of state has confirmed its verdict. The next stage is the ultimate personal horror. You step out of the shadowy great hall, the echo of the guilty verdict still ringing in your ears, and follow Anne Boleyn back to her apartments, now fully transformed from a golden cage to a death chamber. The judgment has been passed, and the countdown begins. The sheer psychological terror of knowing the precise moment of your end is imminent is a burden that few can fathom, yet Anne, in these final hours, begins to display a chilling composure that speaks to both her faith and her famous pride. The most extraordinary aspect of this section of the narrative is the unprecedented preparation for her execution. The mainstream historical fact is that Henry VIII ordered a specialised executioner to be brought from Calais, which was English territory at the time. But the executioner was often cited as from Saint-Omer or France, who was proficient with a sword rather than the traditional crude English axe. This was a gesture of mercy intended to ensure a swifter, cleaner death, fitting for a queen. This choice was politically motivated. Henry wanted the entire unpleasant affair to be over quickly and with as little spectacle or chance for a botched job, which might turn the condemned woman into a popular martyr, as possible. You witness the flurry of activity and hushed instructions around the tower. Carpenters are dispatched to Tower Green, the private execution site reserved for the elite, to construct a low scaffold, draped in black cloth. Unlike the public executions on Tower Hill, this is a meticulously controlled, private event, restricted to a few high-ranking officials and perhaps 100 onlookers. The king is not risking public sympathy. Anne is informed of the king's great clemency, the choice of the sword. The quirky tidbit that follows this announcement perfectly captures her dark, nervous humour. She is reported to have remarked, likely to Sir William Kingston, about her delight because, "I hear say the executioner is very good, and I have but a little mech," putting her hands around it and smiling faintly. This is the same macabre joke she made upon arrival, but now, with the hour set, it carries a profound, chilling finality. It's a defiant, witty last stand, a refusal to grant her persecutors the satisfaction of seeing her utterly collapse. It is the final, brilliant flash of the mind that had once captivated a king. The night before her execution, she manages to write a moving, final letter to Henry. The historians still argue whether it was actually sent, or just intended as a draft for posterity. In it, she maintains her innocence, but offers to forgive him, and ends with a solemn wish that he might live long and govern well. This final act of seeming submission is actually a powerful ethical challenge, condemning him subtly by asking him to reflect on his actions before God. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, you see her preparation. She dresses meticulously in a dark grey or black damask gown, trimmed with fur, a colour choice often associated with mourning and piety. She walks from the Queen's lodgings to the scaffold on Tower Green with a steady, almost serene pace. She is no longer the hysterical prisoner of days past. She has found a quiet, resolute dignity that terrifies the officials watching. As she mounts the scaffold, you notice the special executioner. He is a formidable figure, often described as having an air of foreign competence. He carries a long, keen-edged sword, concealed until the last minute, rather than the heavy, cumbersome English axe. This sword is the physical manifestation of Henry's unprecedented, calculated cruelty and mercy. Anne is required to give a final speech. It is a masterpiece of pragmatic self-preservation, crafted not for justice, but for the future of her family and her daughter Elizabeth. She speaks to the small, elite crowd gathered. "Good Christian people, I am come here to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord." You realise the profound political necessity of these words. She cannot publicly condemn the king. To do so would retroactively endanger her family and negate the legal standing of her death, which was required to be seen as legitimate. By praising him, however holily, she maintains a facade of submission and piety, hoping to protect her surviving relatives and, most importantly, her young daughter. The historians still argue whether Anne Boleyn's final speech was a moment of true Christian forgiveness or a calculated, cold political act designed solely to secure Elizabeth's future. It remains one of the most debated and effective final statements in history. After her speech, she removes her headdress, revealing her neck, and famously prays, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The final moments are swift and expertly handled. The executioner, employing a technique used for beheading with a sword, asks one of the surrounding officials to move forward and speak to Anne, drawing her attention away from him. As her gaze shifts toward the distraction, the swordsman takes his opportunity. The sword flashes briefly, and the deed is done in a single clean strike. The sound is not messy crushing thud of an axe, but a quick sharp slice. The crowd murmurs, perhaps a mix of shock and relief. An eyewitness account notes that the executioner's skill was indeed supreme. Anne Boleyn's body is immediately covered, her head laid to rest beside it. In a final grim irony, Henry VIII had failed to provide a coffin suitable for a queen. A simple, hastily made elm chest was procured, possibly a box used for storing archery bows, to hold her remains. She was carried into the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, located immediately adjacent to the execution site, and interred in an unmarked grave beneath the choir pavement. You stand on the green, watching the soldiers quickly dismantling the scaffold. Within an hour, the physical evidence of the Queen's execution is removed, and the grass is raked clean. Henry VIII was already making arrangements to marry Jane Seymour, the third Queen, proving that his emotional turmoil was brief and his political ruthlessness absolute. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had risked everything and changed the course of England for love, had been erased from the throne in a quiet, bloodless and terrifyingly efficient morning's work. The Tower, the silent witness, had simply swallowed another queen. The black scaffold is gone from Tower Green, but the memory of that sharp, swift stroke of the sword lingers, a cold testament to Henry's surgical cruelty. You're now moving forward in time, past the relatively stable though airless years of Jane Seymour, and into the turbulent late 1530s and early 1540s. While Anne Boleyn's tragedy was deeply personal, her legacy dragged others down with her, none more intimately and ironically than Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford. You remember Jane from Anne's trial. She was the estranged wife of George Boleyn, Anne's brother, and one of the attendants read, spies in the Queen's lodging. Her story is a chilling example of how women in the Tudor court were forced to navigate a deadly hyper-masculine political landscape, often sacrificing loyalty for self-preservation, only to be consumed by the same machine later. The mainstream historical fact about Jane Rochford is that she provided evidence that was central to the conviction and execution of both Anne and George Boleyn in 1536. Her testimony, which allegedly detailed the overly familiar, perhaps incestuous relationship between the royal siblings, was almost certainly fabricated or grossly exaggerated to save her own skin and align herself with the king's enemies. She secured her temporary survival by burying her husband and sister-in-law. After the executions, Jane Rochford didn't retreat into obscurity. She doubled down on her courtly career. You watch her seamlessly transition into the household of the next queen, Jane Seymour, and later into that of Anne of Cleves. She was a survivor, a consummate courtier who knew where the power lay and how to ingratiate herself. She became the very definition of a frenemy, a terrifying figure who was capable of extreme duplicity to maintain her position. It's a pragmatic, if profoundly unethical, strategy for surviving a court where yesterday's favourite could be tomorrow's traitor. She probably convinced herself she was playing the long game, but the Tower had a notoriously good memory. Her next and final political alignment would be with Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife and Anne Boleyn's first cousin. Jane quickly became a lady-in-waiting and a trusted confidant to the young queen. You see her now in the royal chambers, her face a mask of practised loyalty, whispering to Catherine, guiding her, and subtly facilitating her actions. Jane's return to a place of influence in the court of another doomed Queen Boleyn cousin is a layer of dark irony that Shakespeare himself couldn't have improved upon. The quirkier tidbit concerning Jane Rochford is the widespread contemporary and historical assumption that her marriage to George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, was deeply unhappy, which many scholars believe explains her willingness to betray him. Chroniclers suggest that their relationship was fraught, perhaps stemming from George's alleged homosexuality, or more simply, Jane's ambition which clashed with her husband's. There is a particularly persistent, though hard to verify, story that the final straw was Jane's jealousy over George's close intellectual bond with Anne. This personal enmity, far more than any political belief, may have fueled the poisonous evidence she delivered in 1536. Personal vendetta driving political execution. It doesn't get much Tudoresque than that. You are witnessing her second and fatal mistake. Queen Catherine Howard was young, perhaps 19, frivolous, and had a past that was decidedly unsuitable for a Queen of England. She confided in Jane about her youthful indiscretions, relationships with Francis Derham and others before her marriage to the king. Jane, sensing a chance to leverage this intimate knowledge for greater influence, did not advise Catherine to confess the past. Instead, she chose to facilitate a future infidelity. Jane acted as the go-between, the discreet chaperone, arranging secret meetings between Catherine and Thomas Culpeper, a handsome courtier. Jane was literally holding the candle for treason. Why would she do this given the recent brutal history of two queens? The answer is likely a toxic mix of ambition, a deeply flawed sense of security, and perhaps a complete detachment from reality. She had survived the last bloodbath. She must have felt invincible, believing she could manage this secret and use it to rise higher. She was playing a hand with the highest possible stakes, using the crown's secrets as her chips. She forgot, tragically, that secrets in Henry's court were rarely a source of power, but almost always a source of condemnation. Historians still argue whether Jane Rochford acted out of genuine loyalty to Catherine Howard, perhaps believing the young queen deserved happiness, or whether her actions were purely cynical and self-serving, a way to gain further leverage and control over the queen. Given her prior history, the cynical interpretation seemed stronger. She had been rewarded once for betrayal, and perhaps she believed her involvement in the queen's secret life would make her indispensable, or give her material for another strategic betrayal as necessary. This time, however, the secret was exposed before she could choose her move. The scandal breaks. Letters are intercepted. Confessions are wrung out. And the machinery of Cromwell's successor, Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, begins its relentless grind. When the accusations against Catherine and Jane are brought forth, there is no escape. Jane Rochford is arrested in late 1541 and sent to the Tower, arriving through the Traitor's Gate, completing a horrific cyclical journey initiated by her own treachery. You see her confinement, which is reportedly quite different from Anne Boleyn's. While in the Tower, Jane suffered a complete and documented mental breakdown. The strain of the arrest, the realization of her inevitable fate, and the guilt from her past treachery combined to shatter her mind. She became clinically insane, sometimes raving, sometimes catatonic. This is a critical legal and historical point. A person deemed insane could not be tried or executed for treason. Henry VIII, however, was not to be denied his revenge. He passed an Act of Attainder against Jane Rochford, a brutal and chilling piece of legislation that decreed a person could be tried and executed for treason, even if they were insane. This mainstream historical fact is a testament to the king's monstrous determination to have her blood, ensuring that her mental state could not spare her from the consequence of her role in the scandal. It's an administrative decree that codified inhumanity, closing the last possible loophole for the condemned. You are watching Jane, now completely broken, her eyes vacant, unable to recognize her surroundings or offer a coherent defense. She is a woman reduced to a vessel for the king's vengeance. Her final days in the Tower are a quiet, despairing tragedy, devoid of the spirited defiance of Anne Boleyn. She is waiting, not for justice, but for the king's final lethal signature. You leave the spectral image of the shattered Jane Rochford in her Tower cell, and turn your gaze immediately toward the second woman whose fate she disastrously entangled, Catherine Howard. She is Henry VIII's fifth queen, a distant cousin of Anne Boleyn, and arguably the most genuinely tragic figure on this list, a child caught in a political bear trap. To understand the shock of Catherine's execution, you must appreciate her youth and the context of her arrival. Henry VIII was now in his early 50s, obese, paranoid, and suffering from a painful leg ulcer that made his temper even more volatile. His short-lived marriage to the politically advantageous but personally disappointing Anne of Cleves had just been annulled, leaving him cranky and eager for a beautiful English bride. Catherine was that antithesis. She was petite, vivacious, and strikingly beautiful, described as a rose without a thorn. When she arrived at court, she was likely around 18 or 19 years old. You see her now, a burst of youthful energy and fashionable French style, dazzling a court that was accustomed to Henry's increasing gloom. For Henry, she represented a return to his vigorous youth. She was a trophy, a distraction, and an injection of vitality into his failing health. He showered her with jewels and affection, calling her his rose without a thorn, believing he had found a truly innocent wife. The mainstream historical fact is that Catherine Howard's marriage to Henry VIII was largely orchestrated by the Catholic faction at court, led by the Duke of Norfolk and Bishop Stephen Gardiner, who saw her as a vehicle to restore Catholic influence and unseat the reforming party that had been strengthened by Anne of Cleves. You notice that her early life was the exact opposite of innocent. Catherine was raised largely under the lax guardianship of her grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, which she was subjected to minimal supervision. This is where the foundation for her tragedy was laid. She was allowed to run wild, mingle with the household staff, and enter into inappropriate relationships that were considered simple youthful indiscretions at the time, but which became deadly treason when she married the king. The quirky tidbit that illuminates this is the story of her youthful affair with a man named Francis Dereham. Dereham, who was a secretary in the Duchess's household, reportedly called her his wife, and they behaved as such, often sharing a bed and exchanging tokens. Crucially, They were considered to have made a binding pre-contract, an informal agreement to marry, which under the laws of the time could have been grounds to annul her later marriage to the king. Catherine was a victim of her own environment, unprepared for the lethal stakes of the Tudor court, believing her past was simply something she could forget. Her rise was dizzying, but her personality was ill-suited for the complex, treacherous environment of royal power. Unlike the intellectual and politically astute Anne Boleyn, Catherine was simply a girl whose head was easily turned by flattery and handsome courtiers. She was placed on the throne by her relatives, the powerful Howard family, who hoped to control the king through her, but they fatally failed to screen her personal history with the rigour required for such a high-stakes role. You watch as her life at court becomes a gilded prison. The ageing king's smothering devotion, his physical peculiarities, and the immense pressure of the queenly role would have been a crushing burden for a teenager. It wasn't long before her attention was drawn to a handsome, athletic courtier named Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber and, ironically, a man who'd been a favoured companion of Henry VIII himself. This is where Jane Rochford steps back onto the stage, acting as the bridge between the lonely queen and the tempting courtier. You see Jane, the consummate survivor, facilitating the secret midnight meetings. Why would Catherine risk everything? It wasn't political ambition. It was a desperate, foolish craving for normal affection and excitement, a need to escape the reality of her marriage to an aging, sick tyrant. She craved the attention and physical affection that her husband could no longer provide. Historians still argue whether Catherine Howard's relationship with Thomas Culpeper was ever fully consummated, or if it was merely a series of highly incriminating, intimate encounters fueled by Jane Rochford's gossip and facilitation. The legal charges of treason required the will and intention to commit the act, and the clandestine nature of their meetings, the whispered conversations and secret gifts, was enough for Henry's prosecutors to prove treason, regardless of the physical reality. In Henry's eyes, the moment she entertained the thought of infidelity, she had plotted his humiliation, which was tantamount to plotting his death. The net begins to close on her in the autumn of 1541. While the king and queen are on a royal progress, the reforming faction at court, led by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, uncovers evidence of Catherine's premarital affairs with Dereham and Henry Lennox, her former music tutor. Cranmer, terrified of presenting this directly to the volatile king, slipped a letter detailing the accusations into the king's pew at Hampton Court Palace. You observe Henry's reaction, initially furious denial, quickly followed by a terrifying cold certainty of betrayal. He was not merely angry, he was utterly humiliated, his judgment once again proven flawed, his court proven disloyal. He immediately ordered a rigorous investigation. The former lovers Dereham and Manox were found, arrested and tortured. Under duress, Derham confessed not only to the premarital affair but also, crucially, to continuing his familiarity with Catherine after she became queen, facilitated by Jane Rochford. This was the critical difference. Premarital indiscretions were grounds for annulment. Postmarital infidelity was high treason. The shockwave of the arrests tears through the court. Catherine's life, which began in the shadows of the Howard household and briefly shone on the throne, is now spiralling into the inevitable darkness of the Tower. She had believed her past was buried, but in Henry's world, no secret, however old, could be trusted to stay in the ground. The Queen is about to face the consequences of both her past and her present mistakes. You are watching the collapse of Queen Catherine Howard's world, a swift, brutal implosion that began with a piece of paper slipped into a church pew. Her tragedy is rooted in the toxic combination of Henry VIII's need for an illusion of youth and her own desperate attempts to cover a past that was not criminal in itself, but became lethally so when wrapped in a royal marriage. To grasp the depth of her fatal error, we must delve into her secret life before the crown. Catherine grew up in Lambeth, in the household of her grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, which was more akin to a crowded boarding school than a noble finishing school. This environment lacked the stringent, protective oversight that a king's future wife should have received. She was a pretty, flirtatious, and poorly educated girl, the perfect cocktail for youthful mistakes. You are mentally tracing the timeline of her initial premarital relationships. The mainstream historical fact is that Catherine Howard had two key relationships before her marriage to Henry VIII, one with Henry Manox, her music master, and a more serious, possibly contractually binding, relationship with Francis Dereham, a secretary in her grandmother's household. Manox simply taught her to flirt, Dereham taught her about love, and, critically, allegedly called her his wife, establishing a pre-contract that could have voided the king's marriage. When the king's investigators arrested and interrogated these men, they provided the cold, hard proof, the dates, the locations, the intimate details that sealed her fate. The horror wasn't just that she had a past, it was that she kept it a complete secret, a terrible lapse in judgment fueled by her family's ambition. Her uncles, the Howards, desperate to place one of their own on the throne, had neglected to conduct the necessary vetting, or perhaps chose to deliberately overlook the youthful errors, betting that silence would protect her. You feel the crushing weight of that shared conspiracy of silence that would eventually suffocate the young queen. Now, fast forward to her time as queen. Henry VIII is large, immobile and demanding. Catherine is trapped in a marriage that offers immense power but no personal intimacy or freedom. This is where her betrayal takes root. She seeks out the attention she craves in the form of Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, known for his good looks and athletic prowess. This relationship was the act of high treason that led directly to her execution, distinct from the premarital affairs that only provided justification for an annulment. The quirky tidbit here relates to the strange mechanics of their secret meetings. Catherine Jane Rochford would orchestrate their encounters during the king's courtly progress, meetings often happening in late hours, with Jane guarding the door. In one notable instance, Catherine sent Culpeper a letter, conveyed by Rochford, in which she professed her love and worry, adding a terrifying line, "I desire you for to come when my Lady Rochford is here." Existence of this letter, recovered by investigators, transformed the rumour into undeniable evidence of criminal intent and conspiracy, damning all three participants simultaneously. You see Jane Rochford's hand in everything, the constant whisper, the smooth facilitation, the enabling presence. Jane, the ultimate survivor and now double agent for death, was the architect of Catherine's current misery, guiding her to make the same fatal error she had witnessed cost her sister-in-law her life. It's a dark cycle of courtly self-interest in paranoia. Historians still argue whether Catherine Howard understood the catastrophic legal implications of her actions. Was she a naive fool, too young to grasp the law of treason? Or was she simply so desperate for emotional connection that she became recklessly self-destructive? Per later reported panic and despair suggest the former. She viewed her actions as personal infidelity, a mistake of the heart, not an act of high political treason punishable by death. The king, however, saw no distinction. Her body belonged to the crown. Her heart was a matter of state security. The moment of catastrophic failure came with the arrest of Francis Dereham. Under interrogation and likely torture, Dereham confessed to everything. But more importantly, he named Catherine's current favourites at court, including Thomas Culpeper and Jane Rochford, and claimed that the Queen had planned to leave Henry and marry Culpeper after the king's inevitable death. This elevated the crime from simple adultery to a full-blown plot against the king in the succession. The king's honour and the stability of the Tudor dynasty were now linked to the fate of a foolish young girl. You feel the atmosphere shift from suspicion to certainty. The council now had the evidence it needed. Cranmer, with characteristic thoroughness, had done his job. Catherine Howard was officially stripped of her title, her household was disbanded, and she was placed under virtual house arrest at Sion House, while the evidence was compiled against her. The most profound betrayal, however, was not by her past lovers, but by her own family. The Howards, realising the immense peril they were in, did not rally to her defence. Instead, they quickly distanced themselves, publicly condemning her in an attempt to protect the rest of their vast and powerful clan from the king's overwhelming wrath. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, wrote a frantic letter to Henry, assuring the king that he would willingly serve as the executioner for every member of his family involved in the conspiracy. Catherine was a sacrificial lamb, offered up by her own bloodline to appease the Tudor lion. The Queen, now totally isolated, began her final descent toward the Tower. She was not allowed to send letters or have visitors save for the king's agents. Her fate was now being debated in Parliament, leading to the infamous Act of Attainder, the same legal shortcut used for Anne Boleyn that would allow for her execution without the formalities of a full public trial. The final stage of her journey, from house arrest to the Traitor's Gate, was imminent. She was no longer queen, she was simply a woman with a dangerous past and an impossible future. You stand at Sion House, west of London, where Catherine Howard has been held since her initial interrogation. It is early 1540, 1955. End quote. Problem, says I. The king, already back in London, has passed the ultimate political sentence, an act of attainder against his queen and her co-conspirators. This act, like the one used against Anne Boleyn, is a terrifying legislative shortcut, declaring guilt without the necessity of a formal trial. The king does not need justice, he simply needs her removed. The realization of her fate shatters any remaining composure. While at Sion House, Catherine reportedly suffered a profound mental collapse. The sheer weight of her situation, the betrayal, the royal fury, and the knowledge of the block drove her to hysterics, fits, and incoherence. She was often heard weeping uncontrollably, screaming that she was a queen but knew she must die like a common thief. This is the period where she is said to have dictated a final desperate plea to Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was ironically tasked with recording her confession and providing spiritual counsel. The mainstream historical fact here is that Catherine Howard, under spiritual duress from Cranmer, signed a detailed confession. In this document, she admitted to the premarital affairs with Manox and Dereham, but most critically, she confessed to the intent to commit adultery with Thomas Culpeper while Queen. She reportedly blamed Jane Rochford for facilitating the meetings, but ultimately took responsibility for her own foolishness. This confession was not intended to save her life. The Act of Attainder had already condemned her, but was used to validate the king's monstrous decision in the eyes of Parliament and the Church, solidifying the legal justification for her execution. You watch as the final orders are given. The disgraced queen must be returned to the Tower of London to face her death, on the very ground where her cousin, Anne Boleyn, had died. Her transfer from Sion House to the Tower is described as a cold, terrifying dash across London, a public humiliation designed to erase any lingering public sympathy. It is a grim, overcast day. To see the procession, a small guard of men-at-arms, a few grieving loyal servants, and the Queen herself, wrapped against the cold, probably in a simple carriage rather than a royal litter. This is not the Traitor's Gate arrival by river, but a rapid overland journey, intended to be less of a spectacle than Anne's entry, yet carrying an equal weight of doom. You feel the carriage wheels rattling over the frozen cobbles of the winter streets. The route takes her past crowded areas of the city, and though the guards try to keep the crowds back, you hear the muffled, shocked murmurs of the populace as they realise the identity of the condemned woman. The public, who had initially embraced the young, beautiful queen, now view her with a mixture of pity and moral condemnation, effectively managed by the state's propaganda machine. The quirkier tidbit surrounding this journey is the popular but historically dubious legend that Catherine, upon arriving at the Tower, made a desperate escape attempt, allegedly running down the corridor of the stone gallery at Hampton Court, where she was held, before Sion, and screaming for the king's mercy, only to be dragged back by the guards. While the location is debated, the emotional truth of the story, the queen driven to madness, futilely begging her husband to intercede, is likely accurate to her psychological state. It captures the sheer irrational terror that consumes a condemned noble, stripping away the mask of royalty to reveal pure human fear. When she finally arrives at the Tower, she is not taken to the relatively comfortable Queen's lodgings where Anne Boleyn stayed, but likely confined to the much smaller, darker rooms in the Lieutenant's lodging, or perhaps the Bell Tower. A much sterner form of confinement fitting her current status as a fully condemned traitor. This physical degradation reflects her total removal from royal dignity. The cold stone, the silence broken only by the bells and the guards' footsteps, is a stark contrast to the pampered life of a queen. You sense the atmosphere in the Tower is heavy with the ghosts of the past. Her cousin Anne's story is still fresh in the minds of the yeoman warders and the officials. Catherine is now occupying the same literal and symbolic space of betrayal and death. This is the second queen, a girl barely out of her teens, to be delivered to Henry VIII's ultimate execution ground. The precedent is now set. The king's wives are disposable, and the Tower is the official exit door. Inside her confinement, the emotional turmoil continues. She is given a few days to prepare for her execution. Thomas Cranmer remains present, offering spiritual counselling and ensuring she is calm and prepared to confess her sins before God. He reports that she accepts her fate, viewing her past actions as sins against the king and God, and asks only that her relatives, the Howards, be spared the same fate. Her final concern is not for political manoeuvring, but for the safety of her family, a sign of her complete resignation. Historians still argue whether Thomas Cranmer's role in obtaining Catherine Howard's final confession was an act of compassionate spiritual care, or a chilling final act of service to the king? Was he genuinely concerned for her soul, ensuring she died a good Christian, or was he primarily ensuring the king had all the necessary legal and theological cover for the impending execution? It is a complex historical knot, but the result is undeniable. Cranmer secured the confession that justified the block. The contrast between the two queens, Anne Boleyn, the intellectual, fierce fighter who maintained her innocence, and Catherine Howard, the fragile victim who succumbed to despair and confessed her sins, is stark. Anne fought the political machine. Catherine was crushed by it. You stand in the silence of the Tower courtyard, awaiting the morning of February 13th, 1542. She is the next piece of human collateral to be sacrificed on the altar of the king's insatiable will. The execution of Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham had already taken place on Tower Hill, their bodies dismembered and displayed as a brutal warning. Now the Queen must follow. You now find yourself within the cold, damp confines of the Lieutenant's lodging, perhaps the notorious Bell Tower at the Tower of London, observing Catherine Howard in her final days. This is a far cry from the opulent, albeit restrictive, Queen's lodgings that housed Anne Boleyn. Catherine is a condemned traitor now, and her imprisonment reflects that brutal demission. The atmosphere is heavy with the scent of fear, and the silence is broken only by the mournful chime of the bell tower, counting down her remaining hours. Catherine's mental state during this final confinement is one of the most poignant aspects of her story. Having arrived in a state of near total collapse, the isolation and the grim reality of her surroundings only intensified her despair. She is barely coherent at times, alternating between bouts of hysterical weeping and long periods of catatonia. The guards and officials are under strict orders to maintain vigilance, but even their reports speak of the deep pity they felt for the young queen, who was clearly incapable of processing her fate. The mainstream historical fact is that Catherine Howard's profound mental distress upon her arrest and confinement led to a temporary postponement of her trial proceedings, and ultimately necessitated the passing of the Act of Attainder to circumvent the legal impossibility of trying a person who is deemed clinically insane. Henry VIII's willingness to create a law to ensure the execution of a mentally broken woman is a chilling testament to his need for absolute retribution. You watch as the religious council, most notably Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, visits her. Cranmer is not just a spiritual advisor. He is an agent of the state, tasked with ensuring she dies a good Christian death, which, in the Tudor context, means fully accepting her guilt for treason against the king and God. He's trying to lead her toward confession and repentance, not as a means to save her life that is impossible, but to save her soul and provide a final public justification for the king's actions. The quirkier tidbit concerning her final days focuses on the preparation for her death. Because she was executed by the block, not the French sword, the execution was set for Tower Green, like Anne Boleyn's. However, given her terrified and weak state, Catherine reportedly asked for the block to be brought to her cell the night before her execution. She requested this macabre rehearsal so that she could practice laying her head upon it, ensuring that her executioner's job would not be botched due to her flinching or struggling. This request, if true, is a heartbreaking glimpse into the self-possession she attempted to muster against her overwhelming fear, trying to control the uncontrollable final moment. You perceive the profound loneliness of her confinement. She is cut off from her family, who have publicly disavowed her, and her co-conspirators Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham have already been executed and their heads displayed on London Bridge. She is the final piece of the scandal to be cleansed. Every minute is weighted by the knowledge that outside her stone walls, the world is moving on. Henry VIII is already contemplating his next wife, and her image is being systematically erased from the official court record. Her youth, which should have afforded her some measure of protection or pity, is now merely a tragic footnote to the king's cruel necessity. The debate surrounding her innocence still echoes through the Tower walls. Historians still argue whether Catherine Howard's youth and evident lack of political shrewdness should mitigate the verdict of treason against her. Was she genuinely a calculating adulteress plotting against the crown, or simply a terrified child who made terrible errors in judgment, exploited by ambitious relatives in her own desperate yearning for love? Most modern scholars lean heavily toward the latter, viewing her as a victim of a system that placed impossible demands on women and punished their failures with exceptional severity. Her crime was arguably not malice, but simply inadequacy for the role thrust upon her. Her final recorded hours are marked by a deep, despairing resignation. Cranmer reports that by the end, she had achieved a measure of calm, accepting her fate as divine punishment for the mistakes of her past. This calm, however, is not the proud dignity of a martyr, but the spiritual exhaustion of a soul worn down by grief and terror. She dictates her final words, not of political defiance, but of regret and repentance, asking the people to pray for her soul. They see the preparations being finalised outside her window, the small, quiet activity of the executioner and the guards, the low murmur of the officials gathering. The scaffold is small, covered in black, a familiar stage for the Tower's bloody dramas. Her execution has been delayed for a few days, ostensibly for Parliament to complete the necessary formalities, but perhaps also for Cranmer to ensure her soul was in a state of grace. This delay only prolonged the agony. The psychological toll of these final days is incalculable. She is alone, broken, and waiting for the ultimate betrayal. The Tower, the fortress that should have been her sanctuary, has become her tomb. It is a place that transforms ambition into ashes, and in Catherine's case, transformed youthful folly into state treason. Her final morning is about to break, and she will soon meet her cousin's co-conspirator, Jane Rochford, for one last dreadful walk onto the green. You are now standing on the hallowed and blood-soaked ground of Tower Green, watching the final sombre preparations. It is the morning of February 13th, 1542. The air is cold and crisp, a harsh winter light illuminating the low scaffolds draped in black velvet. The execution of Catherine Howard is to be a joint affair, a dual tragedy that links the innocent victim with her manipulative accomplice, Jane Rochford. This simultaneous execution is a rare event for the Tower Green, emphasising the king's desire to tie the two women irrevocably together in the public consciousness as co-conspirators. Jane Rochford, despite the act of attainder enabling her execution while insane, is brought forth first. You see her, a broken, perhaps lucid figure led out to the scaffold. Her earlier mental instability is noted in official reports. She is no longer the scheming courtier, but a woman physically and mentally depleted by her ordeal. The mainstream historical fact of this joint execution is the necessity of Jane Rochford's presence. Henry VIII, despite Jane's documented insanity, insisted on her execution primarily to prevent any future claims of illegitimacy against her deceased husband George Boleyn, or any legal challenge to the confiscated Boleyn estates. Her death served a clear financial and legal clean-up operation for the Crown, demonstrating that even mental illness could not save a person whom the king deemed a threat to his financial political settlements. Jane Rochford's final speech, though delivered by a woman who had been declared insane, is remarkably composed and focused on religious repentance rather than political protest. She admits to having led a sinful life, confesses to deserving her fate, and asks the forgiveness of God and the king. Crucially, she avoids any direct mention of her betrayal of the Boleyns in 1536, suggesting a final, desperate attempt to save her soul without compounding her political crimes. You watch as she kneels. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who was killed by a sword, Jane Rochford is executed with the traditional English axe. Her end is quick, a brutal punctuation mark on a life of constant self-interest and ultimate tragedy. Then, the focus shifts to the arrival of Catherine Howard. She walks from her confinement to the scaffold, a slight, frail figure in a dark gown. There are eyewitness accounts that suggest she was initially terrified, but by the time she reached the green, she had mustered an astonishing, heartbreaking dignity. The sight of Jane Rochford's covered body lying nearby must have confirmed the finality of her own fate, forcing a terrible composure upon her. The quirkier tidbit surrounding Catherine Howard's death is the widely reported notion that she was given an elixir or some strong wine just before she walked out to the green, not to numb her pain, but to calm her hysteria and ensure she did not disgrace herself, and by extension the king, in her final moments. This small, cold measure of control is a classic example of Tudor officialdom prioritising the decorum of the state spectacle over the suffering of the individual. Catherine's final speech, though perhaps a little weak in delivery, mirrors her cousin Anne's in its calculated necessity. She confesses her sin, her sins, plural, referring to her pre- and post-marital follies, and acknowledges that the law condemned her. She praises the king, calling him a gentle and merciful lord, a required lie intended to safeguard the reputation of the king and perhaps to secure a quicker passage for her soul. She states that she dies a queen, but would have preferred to die the wife of Thomas Culpeper. a deeply personal and treasonous admission that was quickly suppressed by the officials present, but was later recorded by chroniclers. It's a final defiant act of the heart. You watch as she kneels, her small frame contrasting sharply with the heavy executioner and the massive block. She does not practice her positioning this time. She simply bows her head, reciting the traditional final words. Lord, have mercy on my soul. Christ, have mercy on my soul. The axe falls swiftly. The combined political effect of the two women's deaths is palpable. The king has purged his court of the entire scandal, removing both the guilty queen and the one who made her guilt possible. The message is absolute. The monarch's will is not to be trifled with, and no amount of family loyalty or former affection can stand in the way of state security and royal honour. Historians still argue whether the primary historical significance of Catherine Howard's execution lies in the establishment of a dangerous legal precedent, the act of attainder for insanity, or any emotional impact it had on the king, driving him further toward paranoia and the realization that finding a suitable queen was a near impossible task. Her death confirmed that for Henry VIII, women were not partners but instruments of state policy, and any failure in their function was punishable by the ultimate penalty. The bodies of both women are immediately covered, and, in a parallel to Anne Boleyn's unceremonious burial, are carried into the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula and interred beneath the pavement near Anne's unmarked grave. The Tower has consumed its second and third high-profile female victims, drawing a chilling, blood-soaked line between the Boleyn cousinhood and the Tudor bloc. As the small gathering disperses and the scaffold is once again dismantled, you feel the chilling weight of the collective silence on Tower Green. The execution of Catherine Howard and Jane Rochford closes a terrifying chapter of Henry VIII's reign, setting the stage for the next, equally high-stakes drama that would soon unfold upon this very spot. For the first time, you realise that the cycle of violence at the Tower is not random. It is a predictable, necessary function of absolute power. The move forward in time once more, past the death of the king who had such an insatiable appetite for wives, Henry VIII, and into the brief, turbulent reign of his young son, Edward VI. The focus now shifts from the familial tragedy of Henry's queens to a pure, unadulterated political execution, that of Lady Jane Grey. You perceive the political air as heavy and electric, charged with the volatile mixture of religious zealotry and power-hungry nobility. Edward VI, a staunch Protestant, dies young in 1553, and the matter of succession throws the entire kingdom into chaos. This is not a personal drama, this is a constitutional catastrophe, a Game of Thrones played with lethal stakes. Lady Jane Grey was a great-granddaughter of Henry VII, a brilliant, pious and highly educated young woman. She was known to prefer reading classical philosophy and Greek to the frivolous entertainments of the court. She was also, unfortunately, the pawn of her ambitious father-in-law, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who was keen to maintain Protestant supremacy and his own power. The mainstream historical fact here is that Edward VI, on his deathbed, was persuaded by Northumberland to issue a devise for the succession, excluding his half-sisters, the Catholic Mary and the potentially problematic Elizabeth, and naming his cousin, the Protestant Lady Jane Grey, as his heir. This move was a direct violation of Henry VIII's will and an act of Parliament, making the entire succession legally shaky and dangerously contested. The moment Jane was placed on a throne, her life became a political sacrifice waiting to happen. You watch as the crown is literally forced upon her. She is described as being deeply reluctant, refusing the crown when it was first offered, protesting that the rightful heirs were Mary and Elizabeth. Jane did not crave power, she craved her books and her peaceful intellectual life. She was essentially dragged from her studies and installed as Queen in the Tower of London, the traditional place of residence for newly crowned monarchs before their coronation procession. She resided in the royal apartments, not as a celebration, but as a guarded temporary fixture. For 9 days she reigned, 9 days of terrified confusion, political manoeuvrings outside the Tower walls. The reaction of the populace was swift and decisive. They largely rallied around Princess Mary, Henry VIII's eldest daughter, recognising her claim as the legitimate heir under the terms of Henry's will. Mary, demonstrating a surprising political acuity and strength, raised an army and marched toward London. The quirky tidbit that encapsulates Jane's brief reign involves a subtle protest she made. Upon being told that her husband, Guildford Dudley, would be named king, she flatly refused. She declared that while she would make him a duke, the crown belonged solely to her, and she would not share her monarchical title with him. This tiny act of defiance shows the steel beneath her scholarly exterior, a principled refusal to allow her husband's ambition to further complicate an already untenable situation. The tide turns quickly. Northumberland's support melts away as nobles realise the strength of Mary's popular claim. You witness the moment of Jane's downfall, Northumberland is captured, and Mary is proclaimed Queen of England. The very officials who proclaimed Jane as Queen now rush to proclaim Mary, an act of astonishing political agility and profound cowardice. On July 19th, 1553, Lady Jane Grey's 9-day reign comes to a screeching halt. She is informed that she is no longer Queen, and ironically, she is immediately confined within the Tower, the same place she had been reigning from, but now as a prisoner of state. She moves from the Queen's apartments to the gentleman gaoler's lodgings, a far less comfortable place of confinement, her life shrinking from the throne to a single cold room. Her immediate arrest and imprisonment are less about personal animosity from Queen Mary I, and more about political necessity. Initially, Mary was inclined to show mercy to Jane, recognising her as a victim and a pawn. She released several other figures involved in the plot. However, Jane remained a dangerous Protestant figurehead, a rallying point for those who opposed Mary's Catholic restoration. Historians still argue whether the initial mercy shown to Lady Jane Grey by Queen Mary I was genuine, based on a shared familial bond and pity for her youth, or simply a tactical delay, a calculated waiting period until Mary's power was completely consolidated, and Jane's political utility as an alternative figurehead was thoroughly neutralised. The delay ultimately led to Jane's demise, as subsequent events would prove. You follow Jane into her confinement. Her imprisonment is lengthy, lasting several months. She is kept under close guard but allowed books and pen and paper. Her time is spent in piety and study. She is constantly visited by Queen Mary's agents, who attempt to convert her to Catholicism, offering her salvation and, implicitly, her life, in exchange for recanting her Protestant faith. Jane, however, remains resolute, defending her beliefs with the same intellectual rigour she applied to her studies. Her Protestant conviction is now the final, unbreakable barrier between her and freedom. This intellectual and spiritual defiance, however admirable, was the final nail in her coffin. The subsequent major political upheaval, the Wyatt Rebellion in early 1554, which aimed to depose Mary and place Elizabeth on the throne, though Jane was the official rebel choice, sealed her fate. Although Jane was not actively involved in the rebellion, her continued existence and her Protestant faith was an irresistible invitation for further rebellion. Mary, now secure on her throne but terrified by the rebellion, could no longer afford to be merciful. The Tower, Jane's reluctant palace, now transforms into her permanent prison. The sentence of death is reactivated. She is informed that she must die. Jane, resigned but calm, now prepares for the ultimate finality. You are now immersed in the political firestorm of the summer and autumn of 1553, the period of Lady Jane Grey's 9-day reign and subsequent incarceration. The air within the Tower walls is thick with anxiety, not the personal terror of Anne Boleyn, but the systemic fear of a nation teetering on the edge of civil war, fuelled by religion. "We have all this, then," said the Tower. Jane's tragedy is the direct result of a succession crisis that her own ambitionless nature was entirely unsuited for. The core of the crisis, as you know, lay in the death of Edward VI, and the direct violation of the line of succession established by his father Henry VIII. Henry's will, which had been sanctioned by Parliament, stated that should Edward die without issue, the crown would pass to Princess Mary, then Princess Elizabeth. However, Edward VI, urged on by his chief minister, the supremely ambitious John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, sought to preserve the Protestant faith by overriding this arrangement. The mainstream historical fact is that Northumberland engineered the device for the succession, to install Jane Grey, not because she was the best candidate, but because she was married to his son, Guildford Dudley, ensuring that the crown and the immense power it commanded would remain within his family. You witness the catastrophic failure of this plan. Northumberland's move was an act of profound political miscalculation. He severely underestimated the popular and legal support for Mary I, the rightful heir in the eyes of the populace and much of the nobility. Mary, a devoted Catholic, had the powerful claim of legitimacy, which transcended the religious fears of many Englishmen. The moment she fled to East Anglia and began rallying support, the foundation of Jane's fragile rule crumbled. The reaction of the Privy Council, the very men who had solemnly proclaimed Jane as Queen, is a study in abject cowardice and swift self-preservation. End of chapter 27. You see them, almost in a comedy of errors, abandoning the tower in Northumberland in a frantic dash to pledge allegiance to Queen Mary I. The speed of their desertion is breathtaking. One day they are celebrating Jane's ascension, the next they are kissing Mary's hand, pleading that they acted under duress. This shift confirms a dark truth about the Tudor court. Loyalty was not a virtue, it was a temporary transactional asset. Jane's arrest is immediate and deeply ironic. She's not led to the Traitor's Gate, but simply stripped of her title and moved from the royal apartments, where she had lived as queen, to the gentleman gaoler's lodging in the inner precinct of the Tower. A sudden, jarring shift from a palace to a prison cell. This physical transition perfectly reflects her abrupt fall from power. The quirky tidbit from the moments immediately following her arrest is her reported reaction. When her father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, came to her room to deliver the news that she was no longer queen and must submit to Mary, Jane is said to have calmly replied that she had accepted the crown with constraint and resigned it with far greater willingness. She was more relieved to escape the political machinations of Northumberland than she was distressed about losing the crown. This response speaks volumes about her genuinely scholarly and unambitious nature, proving she was truly a reluctant pawn in a game she neither started nor desired to play. You observe her new reality. Her husband, Lord Guildford Dudley, is also imprisoned in the Tower, though in a separate location. Her father-in-law, Northumberland, faces immediate trial for treason. Jane, however, is spared the immediate threat of execution. Queen Mary initially views her as a victim and a child, and the public shows considerable sympathy for the young, learned former queen. Mary's reluctance to execute Jane is genuine, but Jane's position is inherently dangerous. She is the living, breathing alternative Protestant monarch. The Act of Attainder is passed against her and her husband in November 1553, condemning them to death, but the sentence is initially suspended. The suspense creates a period of agonizing uncertainty for Jane, where every dawn might bring either a pardon or a death warrant. This legal limbo is a form of psychological torture, forcing her to rely entirely on the capricious mercy of the queen she had usurped. Historians still argue whether Queen Mary I's decision to initially spare Lady Jane Grey was an act of political wisdom designed to avoid alienating moderate Protestants, or an act of profound personal compassion rooted in her own experience of political persecution under her father's rule. The prevailing view is that it was a mix of the two, but ultimately, the politics of the succession would override any personal empathy. Jane was a liability, and in the volatile atmosphere of Tudor religious politics, liabilities were not tolerated for long. Mary's decision to pardon Jane's father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, further highlights her initial leniency. She was attempting to govern with mercy. However, the actions of others would irrevocably destroy this hope. The crisis deepens dramatically with the eruption of the Wyatt Rebellion in early 1554. This Protestant uprising, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger, was explicitly aimed at deposing Mary, preventing her marriage to the Catholic Philip of Spain, and, critically, installing Princess Elizabeth on the throne, though many rebels still saw the deeply Protestant Lady Jane Grey as the more legitimate religious figurehead. Even though Jane and her family were completely innocent of involvement in the rebellion, the fact that her name was invoked by the rebels sealed her fate. Wyatt's rebellion provided the clear, undeniable evidence that Jane Grey's continued existence posed an unacceptable risk to the stability of the crown in Mary's life. You see Mary's hand forced. Mercy, in this context, had proven itself to be a deadly threat. The Tower is about to claim its fourth high-profile female victim, not for personal infidelity, but for being a symbol of a dangerous alternative future. The final fatal decision has been made. You stand now in the small, cold chamber of the gentleman gaoler's lodging within the Tower, the space where Lady Jane Grey spent the long, agonizing months between her arrest and her execution. The date is early 1554. Outside these walls, the Wyatt Rebellion has been crushed, and its failure has brought with it the certainty of Jane's death. The precarious balance of Queen Mary I's initial mercy has been shattered, replaced by the crushing political necessity of eliminating a potential rival and symbol of Protestant resistance. Jane's confinement is marked by a profound spiritual fortitude that contrasts starkly with the hysteria of Catherine Howard and the political defiance of Anne Boleyn. She is not weeping hysterically or plotting escape. Instead, she is immersed in religious devotion and scholarship. She spends her final months writing, studying, and preparing her soul for death. You see her penning letters to her sister and father, letters that are masterpieces of pious resignation and theological argument, emphasizing the supremacy of salvation through faith alone, the core tenet of her Protestantism. The mainstream historical fact here is that Queen Mary I, a staunch Catholic, desperately sought to save Jane's soul, if not her life. Throughout her imprisonment, Jane was subjected to repeated visits from Catholic theologians and priests, most notably John Feckenham, the Abbot of Westminster. Feckenham was sent by Mary to convert Jane to Catholicism, arguing that by recanting her faith, she could save her soul and potentially create a political opening for Mary to grant a full pardon. This effort was a genuine attempt at both spiritual salvation and political mitigation. You watch as the debate unfolds in her cell. It is an extraordinary historical scene. A highly educated 17-year-old girl holding her own against one of the most learned Catholic figures in the kingdom. Jane meets Feckenham's arguments not with hysterical crying, but with calm, precise theological counter-arguments, citing scripture and Protestant doctrine. The debates, which were later recorded, show Jane as completely unwavering. She was, quite literally, dying for her faith. The quirkier tidbit from this period involves a physical space in her lodging that Jane allegedly used. In one of the walls of her room, in the Gentleman Gaoler's lodging which still stands today, you can find inscriptions, including names and dates. Though none can be definitively attributed to Jane, the popular legend holds that she scratched or wrote a short, poignant farewell or a piece of religious verse on the wall, a physical testament to the spiritual conviction that fortified her isolation. While historians still argue the authenticity of such tower wall inscriptions, they reveal the enduring romantic image of Jane, a scholar whose final acts were intellectual and spiritual rather than emotional or political. Jane's unwavering commitment to her Protestant faith was the ultimate roadblock to her freedom. Queen Mary could perhaps forgive the act of usurpation which Jane never truly desired, but she could not tolerate the continued existence of a legitimate Protestant claimant whose existence was a rallying cry for rebellion. When Feckenham finally returned to Mary, he had to report his complete failure. Lady Jane Grey would not convert. Her spiritual defiance sealed her political fate. Historians still argue whether Lady Jane Grey's refusal to convert was primarily an act of genuine religious conviction or a calculated political maneuver to assume the role of a Protestant martyr. Given her deep theological background and her complete lack of political ambition, most scholars conclude that her refusal was a matter of deep personal faith. She recognized that by dying a Protestant martyr, her cause, the Protestant succession, would be better served than if she lived as a Catholic apostate. This decision, however tragic, demonstrated an extraordinary degree of principled resolve for a young woman. As the day of her execution is set, February 12th, 1554, later moved to the 13th, Jane receives the final grim news. She will be executed privately on Tower Green. Her husband, Guildford Dudley, is to be executed publicly on Tower Hill. This separation is perhaps a final cruel gesture from the Queen, who sought to prevent any possibility of a dramatic combined martyr's death on a public stage. You witness the profound separation. Jane writes a final note to her husband in a Greek testament, a book she sends to him before his death, signing it, "Your loving wife, Jane Dudley." It is a heartbreaking act of personal connection, an affirmation of their shared love and faith in the face of their forced imminent separation by the axe. On the morning of the 12th, a crowd gathers on Tower Hill. You see Guildford Dudley led out, giving a final, tearful confession and submitting to the axe. His headless body is then carried back through the tower gates on a cart, covered by a cloth, passing within sight of Jane's window. This final, brutal image, the sight of her dead husband's body returning to the fortress, was likely Jane's final test of fortitude before her own execution the following day. It is an intentional, calculated cruelty designed to break any remaining spirit. But Jane remains unbroken. She asks for Feckenham to return, not to debate, but to simply offer comfort. She has made her peace with the world and with God. The Tower, which had tried to crush her faith and her spirit through isolation and terror, finds her defiant until the very end. The stage is set for her final, private walk to the Green, a walk where every step is a statement of faith. You are now fixed on the solemn morning of February 12th, 1554, though the actual execution occurred on the 12th, and the 13th was often cited in later chronicles due to the proximity of her husband's death on the 12th. Jane's execution was definitely on the 12th, immediately after her husband's body was returned. The Tower of London is shrouded in a deep, sorrowful quiet. This is the day Lady Jane Grey, the Scholar Queen, pays the ultimate price for the political ambitions of others. The final scene is set on the Tower Green, the exclusive private execution spot reserved for royalty and nobility whose public execution might incite riot or sympathy. The secrecy underscores Queen Mary I's desire to maintain order and control the narrative. Unlike the spectacle on Tower Hill, this gathering is small, consisting of the Constable of the Tower, select members of the Queen's Council, and the executioner, creating an intensely personal and terrifying environment for the condemned. Jane is led from the gentleman gaoler's lodging, where she had witnessed the return of her husband Guildford Dudley's body only moments earlier. This final, brutal psychological blow failed to break her. She walks with a quiet, composed dignity that astounds the officials present. She is dressed simply, perhaps in a dark plain gown, a contrast to the rich silks and velvets of her brief reign. In her hand, she carries a book, the Greek Testament, which has been her constant comfort. The mainstream historical fact that defines this moment is that Lady Jane Grey was executed for high treason, not for the act of usurpation, but for her continued existence as a focal point for Protestant rebellion, specifically the failed Wyatt Rebellion. Her death was a political sacrifice deemed necessary to stabilise the realm and secure Queen Mary I's Catholic rule against further insurrection. She was a threat to the established order simply by drawing breath. As she mounts the low, black-draped scaffold, she is offered a final chance to convert by John Feckenham, the Abbot of Westminster, who is in attendance. Jane politely but firmly declines, stating that she has made peace with God and that her salvation lies in her current Protestant faith. She assures him that she will be reconciled with God within the hour, a subtle and powerful affirmation of her belief. Her final speech is delivered with calm eloquence, a chilling departure from the panicked pleas of Catherine Howard and the calculated self-preservation of Anne Boleyn. She admits her error in consenting to the crown, saying she had sinned against the crown of England. However, she maintains that her heart was innocent of any intent to procure the crown for herself and blames those who forced her into the position. This is her final clear defence. She admits the technical crime of treason, the act of accepting the crown, but denies the moral crime of ambition. She asks those present to witness that she dies a true Christian woman, washed of her sins, and asks for their prayers. The quirkier tidbit of this final scene involves her interaction with the executioner. After her speech, she kneels to pray and then rises to prepare herself. Unable to easily untie the clothes and headdress that obscure her neck, she turns to the ladies attending her and asks them to assist her in preparing for the block. One of the saddest details recorded is her final query to the executioner after he finished preparing her. "I pray you dispatch me quickly." The executioner kneels to ask her forgiveness, which she grants him readily. Then comes the moment of profound darkness. Blindfolded and disoriented, she is unable to find the block. Her voice, still calm but carrying a terrifying note of helplessness, cries out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" The Constable of the Tower, or perhaps Feckenham, gently guides her hands to the block. She lays her head down, uttering the final words of the doomed Protestant martyr, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe falls, bringing a swift and merciful end to the young woman's ordeal. The speed and quietness of the execution contrasts sharply with the magnitude of the event. Like the two queens before her, Lady Jane Grey's body is immediately covered and carried a few short paces into the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula and interred beneath the choir pavement, close to the unmarked graves of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. The official records note the simplicity of the interment, reflecting her status as a condemned traitor rather than a queen. The collective impact of this execution is immense. It signals the end of the initial Tudor succession crisis and solidifies Mary I's reign. It also creates a powerful Protestant martyr, instantly bolstering the cause of resistance to Mary's Catholic reforms. Jane's death, though intended to quell rebellion, ultimately provided a potent symbol for future Protestant dissent. Historians still argue whether the execution of Lady Jane Grey was Queen Mary's greatest political mistake. While strategically necessary to end the threat of rebellion, it created a level of public sympathy for the Protestant cause that proved difficult to overcome, forever staining Mary's reputation with the blood of an innocent young woman and contributing to her later, much darker title of Bloody Mary. This single execution, committed out of cold political fear, haunted the rest of Mary's reign. You stand on the green, feeling the faint recurring chill. Three highly prominent women, 2 queens and 1 queen de facto have now been executed privately on this small patch of ground. The Tower has proven its relentless, non-discriminatory appetite for those who fail the king or the queen on the ultimate stage. The silence that follows Jane's death is not peaceful. It is heavy with the weight of political violence, a silence that has seemed to press down on the very stones of the fortress. You step away from the hushed Tower Green, leaving the ghosts of the queens and the scholar behind. The history of female execution at the Tower isn't limited to these famous high-stakes political figures. Indeed, the true horror of the fortress is embodied in the scores of unseen casualties. The women whose names are often footnotes, or sometimes entirely lost to history, executed for crimes that range from petty political defiance to simple, disastrous bad luck. The focus now shifts from the private block within the walls to the public scaffold of Tower Hill, the designated execution site just outside the main fortress gates. While the queens were killed discreetly, most women accused of treason or religious heresy were meant to be made a terrifying example of, their deaths a bloody performance intended to subdue the populace. The mainstream historical fact here is that while the high-profile women were executed for treason, many minor female executions during the Tudor and subsequent periods were for religious nonconformity or adherence to Catholicism during Protestant reigns, and vice versa. This was particularly true under Queen Elizabeth I and Queen Mary I, where shifting religious loyalties meant that yesterday's loyal citizen could be tomorrow's heretic. These women often faced the most brutal form of execution for treason: hanging, drawing and quartering. Though women were usually spared the drawing and quartering due to perceived gender propriety, they were often burned alive for heresy, a fate arguably far worse. You consider the period of Queen Mary I's reign, known bitterly as Bloody Mary. Her Catholic restoration led to the martyrdom of hundreds of Protestants, many of them women. While most of these executions by burning for heresy occurred across the country, several of the individuals condemned were interrogated and held within the Tower of London before being handed over to the civil authorities for their final, brutal ends. Their imprisonment in the Tower was the precursor to the flame. Then you shift to the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. As the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth was a firm Protestant, and her reign was marked by severe crackdowns on Catholic plotters and sympathisers. Many noble women and gentry were implicated in schemes to replace Elizabeth with her Catholic cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. These women, often acting as couriers, spies or harbourers of priests, faced imprisonment in the Tower's infamous cells, such as the Beauchamp Tower, before facing the law. Imagine a woman like Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, though she was executed on Tower Green and not Hill. Her case illustrates the extended reach of political paranoia. Executed under Henry VIII, she was not a queen, but a very old, distant relative, whose only crime was being related to figures who opposed the king. Her death was notoriously clumsy, the executioner allegedly hacking at her neck and shoulders. She was, essentially, executed for her bloodline, a truly chilling precedent that filtered down to lesser nobles. The quirkier tidbit about these minor female casualties involves the use of torture. While the application of the rack and manacles was generally considered inappropriate for women of noble rank, the records suggest that psychological duress and less physical methods of persuasion, such as sleep deprivation, forced standing, and starvation, were certainly used on noble women imprisoned in the Tower to extract confessions about Catholic plots. The official records often tried to maintain a facade of chivalry by claiming gentler methods were used, but the reality was a subtle, prolonged form of mental and physical anguish. One name that sometimes surfaces is that of Elizabeth Barton, the Holy Maid of Kent. Executed in 1534 under Henry VIII, before the Queen's, she was a peasant visionary who prophesied against the king's divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Although her execution was on Tower Hill, her fate was sealed within the Tower. As a woman of lower status who directly challenged the king's will, she was executed for treason and displayed prominently, her head placed on London Bridge, demonstrating that neither gender nor social rank offered immunity from the king's displeasure. You feel the vast, often unmarked history of suffering within the Tower's walls. Not every cell held a queen. Many held frightened ordinary women caught in the massive sweep of political and religious change. They were wives who refused to betray their husbands, daughters who harboured their religious fathers, and servants who were privy to too much dangerous gossip. Their crimes were less grand than treason. They were often crimes of loyalty, which was, ironically, the only virtue that mattered in the volatile Tudor world. Historians still argue whether the high visibility of the executions of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard actually saved lesser noblewomen from similar fates by satisfying the king's public need for revenge, or whether those royal executions simply lowered the bar, making it easier to execute women of lower rank afterwards. It is a debate about the cascading effects of precedent. Did the murder of queens make the murder of countess or gentry women more politically palatable? The increasing number of female casualties suggests the latter is depressingly true. You walk toward the outer ward again, mentally tracing the final path these unseen casualties would have taken, out of the thick, protective stone walls, across the drawbridge, and up the slope of Tower Hill. For them, the walk was a public ordeal, facing the shouts, the jeers, and the morbid curiosity of the vast London crowd. Their execution was deliberately messy, prolonged, and public, a stark contrast to the quiet dignity afforded to the queens on the green. The stories of these minor figures, held in the cold, dark corners of the Salt Tower, or the Cradle Tower, serve as a necessary counterpoint to the high drama of the royal executions. They remind you that the political upheavals of the Tudors did not just affect the elite. They dragged hundreds of ordinary, or at least non-royal, people into the machinery of state terror. The Tower was not just a symbol of royal power, it was the ultimate, inescapable tool of that power, consuming any who opposed it, regardless of their social standing or gender. You realise that the history of the executed queens is merely the highly visible tip of a much deeper, much more terrifying iceberg of human suffering. You are standing now in the quiet of the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula, the small, unassuming church nestled beside Tower Green. This is the final resting place for the women we have traced: Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and Lady Jane Grey, along with countless others, including Jane Rochford, all interred without fanfare beneath the choir pavement. Their remains were mingled with those of other traitors and victims in a kind of grim, egalitarian anonymity. This chapel is the physical embodiment of the Tower's legacy, a place where the highest of the realm were reduced to anonymous dust. The modern view of the Tower of London often separates the stone fortress from the human tragedy, but you now perceive them as one inseparable entity. The legacy of these lost women is not merely a footnote in Tudor history. It is a foundational element of the fortress's chilling atmosphere, and a crucial lens through which to view the evolution of English law and monarchy. The mainstream historical fact here is that the executions of the two queens, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, fundamentally altered the legal relationship between the monarch and their consort, establishing the precedent that a queen could be tried and executed for high treason on the flimsiest of evidence if she failed to fulfil her political function of providing an heir or maintaining the king's honour. This lowered the bar for female execution and made the English queen consort position one of the most perilous roles in Europe. You feel the enduring echoes of their suffering in the Tower's silence. When you walk past the Beauchamp Tower, you see the carvings left by male prisoners, eloquent statements of defiance or despair. But for the executed women, the record of their last days often rests on the cold, dispassionate reports of their male jailers and the prejudiced accounts of their enemies. Their true voices, their uncensored anger, fear or love, are largely lost to us, filtered through the misogynistic and politically charged lens of the 16th century. Consider the contrasting their crimes. Anne Boleyn was executed for ambitious failure, an intellectual and political threat disguised as sexual immorality. Catherine Howard was executed for genuine youthful folly and a desperate, naive search for love. Lady Jane Grey was executed for being an unavoidable symbol of Protestant resistance. Despite the different pretexts, the final result was the same, cementing the Tower's reputation as the ultimate slaughterhouse of female power. The quirkier tidbit concerning the chapel and its occupants relates to the later discovery of their graves. In 1876, during renovations of the chapel, the anonymous graves were opened. The remains of the queens were carefully exhumed and reinterred in coffins marked with their names. The anatomical examination of the bones of Anne Boleyn confirmed the historical accounts of her little neck, consistent with a swift execution by sword, and definitively located her final resting place. This late Victorian acknowledgement, centuries after their deaths, offered a degree of recognition that was brutally denied to them by Henry VIII. The cumulative effect of these tragedies was not lost on the next generation of royal women. You realise that Princess Elizabeth, who would later become Queen Elizabeth I, understood the lesson perfectly. She was imprisoned in the Bell Tower under her half-sister Mary for suspected involvement in the Wyatt Rebellion, the very rebellion that sealed Jane Grey's doom. She saw the block and the axe up close. Elizabeth I's extraordinary political caution, her reliance on a subtle private network of trust, and her famous decision never to marry can all be viewed as a direct, rational response to the terrifying examples set by her mother and cousin on the Tower Green. She learned that for a woman in power, trust was fatal, and the husband was the most dangerous vulnerability of all. Historians still argue whether the memory of the executed queens at the Tower served as a greater deterrent to treason during Elizabeth's reign than the executions themselves did during Henry's. It is widely accepted that Elizabeth governed with a ruthless efficiency, but she executed far fewer high-profile women than her father, often preferring long-term imprisonment or banishment. It is plausible that the Tower's grisly reputation, forged by the deaths of Anne and Catherine, was a far more effective tool of control than the executioner's axe itself. The Tower became the ultimate psychological weapon. The final chilling realization is that the Tower of London is not just a stage for history, it is a character in these stories, an unmoving, silent participant. It welcomed the queens in triumph, held them in despair, and silently accepted their blood. The river still laps against the stone of the Traitor's Gate, the wind still whistles around the bloody tower, and the grass on the green still grows deceptively lush. But the memory of those final terrifying steps remains indelible. The stories of these women, the ambitious, the foolish, and the principled, are eternally interwoven with the fabric of this ancient fortress, a permanent record of the cost of failure in the unforgiving world of absolute power. Their ghosts, if you believe in such things, are not the shrieking, wandering spectres of folklore, but a quiet, deep melancholy that settles upon you as you leave this place, a profound sense of the arbitrary cruelty of fate. And now, as we conclude our long, cold walk through the shadows of the Tower, allow your senses to gently retreat from the hard, chill stone and the metallic tang of history. You are no longer standing on the damp cobbles of the Thames, nor are you listening to the rustle of velvet and the cold, flat sound of the axe. Slowly, allow the stern images of the past to soften and fade, as the flickering torchlight of the Tower finally dims. The stories of Anne, Catherine and Jane, of ambition, misjudgment and resolute faith, will always remain etched into the silence of that ancient fortress, a powerful, sobering reminder of the fragile nature of life and the brutal weight of a crown. But their struggles are over now. They have found their final peace, buried deep in the heart of the stone, far from the machinations of court and the terror of the scaffold. You can let the tension go. You are safe, far removed from the Tudor court, where a single whisper could seal a woman's fate. Take a deep, slow breath. Feel the comforting presence of your own room, the warmth of your blanket, the steady, reliable rhythm of your own heart. The darkness outside your window is just the night, quiet and safe, holding the world gently until morning. Let the echoes of the Tower fade into the deepest parts of your mind, leaving only the quiet knowledge of history behind. Rest now and let the gentle current of sleep carry you away.